Thank you for the opportunity today to contribute something to the important theme of reconciliation. Thank you to the Foundation Dialoog-NJI, and thank you for the translation of my speech. And I know you are in a little bit of time trouble, and you did not ask me to speed up my speech, but I just did. During the speech of Mr. Asano, which I try to follow very intensively because there are specific important notions in his speech which do resonate in my project and my perspective. My project and my book is about a time when compartmentalization between we and them, us and they, was at its maximum. There was a lot of violence the last 5 years in Indonesia, as you all will know. And the interesting thing is that the polar way of thinking was, and the violence which was committed by my father as well on Sulawesi, one of the isles in Indonesia, was the topic and the starting point of my project and book. Is there some... it's this one. Ooh. Yes. From the 90s onward, in the Netherlands, there was a very small debate about Indonesia. The debate in the Netherlands was always completely occupied with the Second World War, and this was a war of heroes, of big national interests on regaining democracy. And the enterprise in Indonesia, and on the right top-hand side you can see the boat. My father was literally among the first 3,000 soldiers who went voluntarily to Indonesia. This war in Indonesia was conceived as some sort of follow-up of the Second World War. We defeated the Germans, and now the Dutch soldiers only had to defeat the Japanese occupying forces in Indonesia. And there was not much discussion in the Netherlands. And it was very striking what Mr. Asano just told me about the relation between your family history and the national history. And there was not much of debate here in the Netherlands. For myself, I never asked my father about Indonesia. I never asked about his special role in the elite forces in one of the most violent episodes in the Netherlands Indies. I never asked, and he never told, so there was no discussion. In our family, it was not a forced silence. There was no frustration. My father was not a violent man. He was not extremely frustrated. He just didn't talk about it. Sometimes, every 3 to 5 years, he mentioned he released a very small remark on Indonesia, and that was all. However, this colonial past holds very important lessons. And with the knowledge of today, and with the knowledge my father took with him into his grave, we can look very deep into the violent past. In September 2018, last year, I traveled some 10,000 kilometers through Indonesia. Now this sounds very impressive, 10,000 kilometers, but if you know, of course, how big Indonesia is, actually it's nothing. I traveled great distances through Indonesia. I met with 1,200 students on 14 universities on 3 different isles, especially on Sulawesi. I met with national history teachers, like on the top left, Anhar Gonggong, who wrote the preface in my Indonesian translation. I also met survivors, eyewitnesses, victims. I had long conversations with 3 of them. These encounters, this journey gave me some kind of reconciliation. Although the project, the journey was not set up as a reconciliation project. The title of the project formally was South Sulawesi Reconsidered. Reconsidered, of course, is not automatically reconciliation. I wanted to give some space into the title. I want to create space for myself, and I wanted to create space for the Indonesian perspectives. I was a bit nervous at the beginning of the journey, but the attitude I encountered in Indonesia was openness, a relaxed attitude, a relaxed atmosphere, acceptance, and a great deal of interest in my story and empathy. Now, this is the cover of my book. You can find it on the table as well. It has been translated into Bahasa Indonesia. This book is a deliberate confrontation, my deliberate confrontation with the painful past of my father. This is my father a few weeks before he leaves to Indonesia, a young guy, full of energy, completely, let's say, loaded with the national narrative, and the national narrative was Indonesia is Dutch property, and there was, in my father's family and at his school, in his church, there was absolutely no discussion. No one ever discussed the question, is Indonesia a piece of the Netherlands? Since my father passed away, I never talked to him about Sulawesi affair. And since my father passed away, I had to search for eyewitness, his former commandos. He was in a commando elite unit. I searched for former commandos who were also at his funeral, and they were very shy. They were very negative about the press in the Netherlands because they were always talked at. There was some articles were written about these elite forces, but there was never a real serious discussion with the elite forces. What did they do? What did they see? What did they expect? Were they ashamed of specific facts? This discussion was absolutely absent in the Netherlands. It was always blaming articles in the media, and half of the population in the Netherlands considered them as some sort of heroes, and the other half as war criminals. Now, the South Sulawesi affair occurred relatively early in the 5 years, and also relatively early in the decolonization process of other countries in Europe. So hardly anything was known about Sulawesi. Imagine you are in an elite troop, and you receive the order to pacify. That was a very nice word, to suppress a resistance on an isle which is 3-4 times bigger than the Netherlands. And you only have 123 soldiers to do the job. And there was hardly anything known about Sulawesi. On Sulawesi, it was really a chaotic atmosphere, a situation. And the leader of this elite troop, Captain Raymond Westerling, and later he became a national symbol for the narrative on Indonesia, he came up with a method which was later called the Method Westerling. And this Method Westerling consisted of the summary executions of people on the spot. And these guys, and my father is in the lower row, these guys, these are, let's say, the Dutch, the Blanda's, the Dutch, the white guys from the group of around 100 men. And if you look very closely at this photo, you can see a strange phenomena, because much of the photos of Dutch soldiers in Indonesia are always with laughing faces. They made some joy. They even made fun with Indonesian people. But this photograph was taken illegally. It was prohibited to take photos because of the operational dangers. What you can see here are very young guys with very serious faces, very tense, very concentrated. And this photo, which is also in my book, of course, is an expression of a strange atmosphere. This photo was taken during the executions, and this group and a larger group executed around 600 Indonesian people without any judicial background. There was no court, there were no formalities, there was no administration, there was no right to appeal. 600 by the elite troops my father was in, and in all, within 12 weeks, 3,000 to 5,000 people would be killed on the isle because the Netherlands, Dutch East Indies Army, the KNIL, and the police as well, military police, also took part in fightings, not in per se in execution, but in fightings. And in 12 weeks, more than 3,000 people were killed, and 600 by the small group my father was in. These executions all followed a specific path, but between the time of your accusal, your indictment, and between the time you were killed, usually between 1 and 3 minutes was left for you to think about your life. There was a KNIL soldier who took some photos illegally of these executions. You can see it's remote. These photos are taken from a distance. And this was one of the two, let's say, open nerves in Dutch national history. And after the Indonesian independence, and this is, let's say, this 1991, this is 41 years after the Indonesian independence, for the first time this elite group gathered. This is 1991 in the Netherlands. These guys have not been seeing each other for 45 years when they met one day. And before meeting, they wrote each other letters and they say, we're going to talk about the great Indonesian food, we're going to talk about the kindness of the Indonesian people, we're going to talk about the beautiness of Indonesian women, but we are not going to talk about South Sulawesi. And later, and I came in contact with all of these men, later they admitted, well, actually, we talked about Sulawesi from the morning till midnight because we had so intense memories, there was so much violence. We did not talk about food, nor about women, nor about Indonesia. We only talked about South Sulawesi. And when I studied the role of my father, I did not only look into, let's say, the political situation or the military situation, I also looked into, and these 3 men operated together next to my father, I looked into their micro-psychology. I looked into group dynamics like self-coercion, group coercion. I looked on the aspect of external encouragement. What happens, what kind of mechanisms do occur when you send a very small group 14,000 kilometers from home with an almost unlimited mandate for the use of violence with, let's say, eroding or absent moral rules. I talked to former commandos. I studied intelligence reports in the archives, and I discovered that there was that this group, which was voluntarily, and these men are part of the television documentary I made together with a famous documentary maker in the Netherlands, Erik Willems. These men were, at the end of their lives, were able to tell a little bit, not everything, but to lift a tip of what's happened. And my book really consists of 600 quotes and 600 interview citations. Now, when I went to Indonesia, the reception in Indonesia, I already told you, I was pretty nervous because I was very much afraid that just dumping the book on the Indonesian market would create a very negative effect. And I was also afraid that people in audience like this, that Indonesian people, victims or students, would stand up and would say, well, you are coming to get some excuse or some reconciliation for the war crimes your father committed on our Indonesian people, and we don't like this story. We don't accept it. You are just trying to create some kind of atmosphere that we can say, well, yeah, we understand about your father. Well, this was the attitude I was afraid of. This did not occur in any way. On all universities there was, and this is especially with the young people, there was a lot of feeling of, there was a lot of empathy. People asked me, really, they asked questions about the emotions my father must have had on Sulawesi. And I really, well, let's say, congratulated, or I really had a lot of respect for questions like these. Important things I even wrote down on a paper, important criteria for me to go to Indonesia, key elements like acceptance, trying to make a connection, sharing history. I wanted to stick to the facts, but I did realize myself that emotions and feelings were as much as important as historically correct facts. And another important thing was that history is not owned by a specific individual or a government. History is not the Dutch history. There's also Indonesian ownership of the history, and in fact there is individual ownership of history. And in Indonesia I really committed myself to the attitude of that I only wanted to talk about the role of my father. I represented only myself and my father. I was not there for any governmental purposes. I was not identifying myself with a national Dutch project on colonial history. And I really made the explicit statement prior to all the speeches and discussions that I try to be neutral, but probably I will not be neutral, or I cannot be neutral. So what I asked to the audiences is, please correct me if I'm wrong, or if my perspective is not right according to your view. And I deliberately wanted to make myself vulnerable. And what I encountered was an Indonesian attitude which the Indonesian attitude was really very positive and respectful. And now I'm going to skip 2 pages, but all the text is in the syllabus, and that's thank you for that. This is one student which I wanted to tell you about 2 specific Indonesians very shortly. About Arjun, a student 17 years old, a sejarah, a history student, in Makassar, on South Sulawesi. And he is currently working together with me in a new oral history project, because Anar Gonggong and I are going to write a new book on the guerrilla warfare in Indonesia. But Arjun, he interviewed his grandmother, and he interviewed her about a very serious topic. His grandmother was raped by Dutch forces, and most probably she was raped during the time my father was in military actions very nearby. And I have great respect for him, because it was out of his own initiative. His family was hiding in a cage underground, a very deep cage of 8 meters underground, hiding for my father, hiding for the Dutch forces. And I'm very glad and honored that he, as a student, speaking the local dialects and languages, is currently acquiring more oral history from Sulawesi and from his family as well. So for me, he represents the Indonesian perspective on the independence struggle. Another person which I wanted to tell you about is Pak Adam. Pak Adam is about at the end of his 80s. His parents were shot during an action where my father was present. His parents were shot in front of his eyes, and together with his aunt, he flew to the mountains and he bivouated in the mountains for months until the Dutch army ordered his aunt and him to go back to their kampong, to their village. Unfortunately, there was nothing to return to, because the kampong was set in fire by Dutch troops. And his story was very impressive. And I asked him, what do you expect of me? What do you expect of the Dutch government? Do you expect apologies? Do you expect money? No, he said. What I expect from Dutch people, not from the government per se, but from Dutch people is just come here and listen to my story. Just listen to me, only for one time. I just want to tell my story, and that's for me, that's enough for me. I don't want any money. Apologize. Could be nice to make apologies, but apologies are also hollow political statements. But I appreciate it highly, he told me, that you come and listen to my story. And I promised him to include his personal eyewitness story in my next book. During the last discussion with the students, it's here. During the last discussion, it was, I guess it was in this discussion, there was a girl, a student, and she said, well, I have 3 questions for you, and these 3 questions all represent the main aspects of how we could write post-colonial history. The first question she asked was, why is history so cruel? Why was so much violence committed from Dutch side and from Indonesian side as well? And also the intra-Indonesian struggle. There was an independence war, a decolonization war, and a guerrilla warfare between Indonesian groups, families, among Indonesian groups and families. Why were these 5 years why was there so much bloodshed? That was her first question. Her second question was, how do we write post-colonial history between the Netherlands and Indonesia? And her third question was, what should we do with our emotions and our feelings? And when she asked these 3 questions, I thought these 3 questions are actually at the center of the post-colonial history writing at the moment. And the first question, of course, I'm not going to state some kind of answers to these very important questions right now. But what is important is that we realize that we do not own history. The post-colonial view on writing history is to include facts, to include emotions as well, and to include, as you have already pointed out very clearly, to try to connect individual micro-psychology with national narratives in order to, let's say, to pitch the national narratives. I've shared a lot in Indonesia, facts, emotions. It was very impressive. And sharing history, and this is what I've done with Mr. Anhar Gonggong. His father, 2 of his brothers and an uncle were executed by the troops of my father. Together we will write a second book, and we concluded that sharing history it's not that difficult. It's about sit down and talk, sit down and listen to the message of another human being, even if that message or even if his information is inconvenient. For me, in the 90s, it was difficult to accept the role of my father. I've grown over it. I've accepted his role. He is the man who committed murder. He is the man who committed incredible deeds in Indonesia. But he is also, and he will always be, the man I love. And this attitude about sit down and talk, try to get in contact with other human beings, that actually is an attitude which should not be unfamiliar to Dutch people. Thank you very much.